Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Hanna.
Thank you. Mr. Norquist, in your testimony, you state that immigrants exhibit different skill sets than native-born Americans, and therefore generally do not compete against each other in the labor market. Could you please elaborate on that point? Much immigration labor is highly skilled and thus presumably not differentiated, is not highly skilled and presumably not differentiated. Why would wage competition not incur in the labor market? And furthermore, knowing that Australia, New Zealand, and other countries differentiate in the skill sets that they ask of people in terms of immigration, is that something you support generally or not?
I'm not sure that doing some Japanese meaty kind of economic planning thing, you're a farm laborer today, therefore you'll be a farm laborer forever. You're a chemical engineer, so you'll be a chemical engineer forever. When you talk to the guys in Silicon Valley, the people who came in on H-1B visas and invented the kind of companies that create tremendous amount of jobs, bounced around. This was not their first effort. It's not the first company they worked for. It's not the first zone that they worked in. So I can imagine some bureaucrat in Australia thinks he's very clever going, oh, we need 3 plumbers, we'll take 3 plumbers today. But in a free society, plumbers can decide to do something else in 2 years, 2 months, or 2 generations. And you get quality people, and the guys who haven't been to prison, and some of the engineering talent that, one of the reasons that people talk about at the high end that certain engineers coming in don't compete with American engineers is we have shortages of particular kind of industries, so that kind of by definition they don't compete, but they will compete by moving to Canada and compete from there. I mean, right, Microsoft has, people they hire and they put in Canada because they can't get them across the border here. So they pay taxes in Canada and make the Canadian economy stronger, and they have to put up with all that snow. Or they stay in India, or they stay in Russia, or they stay somewhere else and compete with us. Okay? In a worldwide, everybody competes with everybody. And the idea that when they come over here, somehow they compete more than where they were, worked before planes and internet and more mobility.
Mm-hmm. You talked about Arizona. If the net cost of public services to unauthorized immigrants in the state had been substantial, and the laws had been intended effect of inducing unauthorized residents and workers to leave, is it clear that the state is now worse off or better off?
Well, the numbers I was looking at talk about wealth and income generated. 200,000 people who were working have left. The value of the housing in Arizona has fallen more rapidly than neighboring states. So we're comparing apples and apples. The only state that's had a worse catastrophe was Nevada in terms of dropping home values. And those jobs weren't picked up by somebody else, meaning that the unemployment in those sectors where people without papers congregated. So that suggests that they weren't displacing some guy, and when they left, the person who had been displaced showed up and said, hey, can I have my job back? Sure. That's not what happened.
So knowing that commonly accepted wisdom is typically wrong, state and local governments bear much of the cost of certain public services, especially related to education, health care, and law enforcement. For both of you, can you speak to that? Because I constantly hear the cost of immigration in terms of social programs. And Doctor?
You want to start?
Yes, Mr. Hanna. So there are 3 things that, as Mr. Norquist pointed out, are faulty in this heritage study. One of them is that it overstates the cost. In one sense, we know that it overstates the cost to law enforcement, to education, because, as was mentioned, these are costs that would be incurred no matter what. In fact, we know that immigrants have a lower rate of incarceration. They're less likely to commit violent and property crimes as well. So if anything, they impose less on law enforcement from that perspective. We also know that naturalized citizens receive lower Social Security income, which is not taken into account in this study by the Heritage Foundation. And in fact, we know that poor foreign-born are less likely to claim benefits than the native-born. So there's evidence of that once you control for everything else.
Is there empirical evidence supporting that the basically pay more in than they receive as a?
Yes, so that's another very important point. One thing is that many of the undocumented have already been contributing, and they've been contributing over the past 10, 20 years. We know that, for example, the Social Security has received $600 billion in their suspense files. These are the unmatched Social Security contributions. So this is money that has already been contributed by undocumented workers. The IRS estimated that between 1996 and 2003, undocumented immigrants contributed about $50 billion in income taxes, and there are good estimates and conservative estimates actually that show that state and local taxes are contributed by the undocumented at the rate of $11.2 billion per year. So this is money that has already been contributed. In addition, as Vice Chair Klobuchar pointed out, there are these dynamic gains. And it is very important to point out that this heritage study does not take account of that. Okay. For example, we know that as a result of legalization and eventual citizenship after 13 years, there would be a 25% gain in earnings and in income that would increase, of course, the tax revenues that we would be obtained from this population. So legalization in itself is something that would contribute to solve some of our fiscal issues. Immigration, as we mentioned before, would increase the earnings of domestic workers as well, and would increase the earnings of the more skilled domestic workers, which precisely means that they are people also who are going to be paying higher revenues into the system.
Mr. Norquist, quickly.
Yeah.
My time is...
Undocumented workers have been paying taxes for some time. They pay sales taxes. How do you get away from that? They pay property taxes, and if they show up with a, the Social Security number, they're paying the Social Security, but they're not going to get out. They pay into income taxes as well. So there is some weird sense that somehow these people are not paying taxes. They pay all the interesting taxes that we run into on any given day without the deductions. And so that's one factor. But the other is, look, we have a challenge. We have a public school system that isn't educating people as well as you'd like. Most of the people that, at higher costs than is necessary, most of the people that affects were born here, okay? If they're not learning American history, the guys who are born here are not learning American history. If they're not learning English properly, the guys who are born here are not getting very good English classes. We know from looking at states that have experimented with school choice that you can dramatically drop the cost of education and increase quality by giving parents choice. If you're worried about the cost of educating people, let's focus on that, not deciding that 3% of the population is the cause of some problem. I'm not sure that that's why the public school system is having troubles in Detroit, all the immigrants showing up in Detroit. There are other challenges that governments have in putting these forward. Medicare, Social Security are not structured to be sustainable. That needs to be fixed. It's not the problem of an immigrant, it's not the problem of a baby, but we ought to fix them for everybody. And let's do welfare reform, as Bill Clinton signed. There are 185 welfare programs, like the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Let's block grant them all, do what Clinton did on welfare reform, dropped costs, made people less dependent. But let's do that for everybody, not targeting some group.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. My time's expired.
Yeah, thank you. And we're going to try now to stay within the 5 minutes.